In the early years of your life, someone told you to stop crying, to not be selfish, to be good, to hide your anger. What they didn't tell you was where all those forbidden emotions would go. They didn't disappear. They accumulated in what Carl Jung called the shadow, the hidden basement of your psyche where you stored every trait, desire, and impulse that didn't fit the image of who you were supposed to be. You spent years building this dungeon, locking away parts of yourself to gain acceptance. The problem? What you bury doesn't die. It waits. This phenomenon coined the term shadow effect, which refers to a situation where repressing unwanted parts of yourself leads to destructive outcomes through unconscious sabotage. You thought you were solving a problem by hiding your flaws. Instead, you created a hidden force that now controls you from behind the scenes. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who mapped the human psyche, observed that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Everyone claims they know themselves, but most people are strangers to their own minds. The more you deny your shadow, the more power it gains. It's almost like the harder you try to be perfect, the more violently your imperfections emerge. Self-awareness is easy to claim, but integration is not so cut and dry. A poorly understood shadow can lead to a tremendous amount of energy being spent sabotaging your own life. Another example to illustrate this point comes from your daily interactions. You meet someone who irritates you for no clear reason. Maybe they're too confident, too ambitious, too loud. You judge them harshly, convinced they're the problem. Can you foresee what's actually happening? That person is reflecting back a trait you've buried in yourself. Your contempt for their confidence reveals your own repressed desire to be seen. Your disgust at their ambition exposes the dreams you've suffocated with excuses. This is projection, the shadow's favorite trick. You don't hate them. You hate the parts of yourself you see in them. But projection also shines a light on a critical aspect of shadow work: how we measure personal growth. This brings us to what we might call the authenticity paradox, similar to Goodhart's law. When being good becomes the target, authentic self-expression ceases to be possible. In our example, the intention was to become an acceptable person by suppressing negative traits. Good behavior was determined as the measure of personal worth. As a result, the measure became your entire identity, and appearing perfect became an object of obsession overnight. You optimized to look better rather than actually becoming whole. In hindsight, the consequences seem obvious. The reward was attached to denial, so more repression equaled more approval until it didn't. Now, let's look at a different example that shows us what happens when shadow integration is not clearly pursued. In your own life, you've probably experienced moments where success was within reach, then suddenly everything fell apart. You were about to get promoted, then made a careless mistake. You were building a healthy relationship, then picked a fight over nothing. You were finally losing weight, then binged for a week straight. First, your shadow operates by creating patterns. The more you approach something you unconsciously believe you don't deserve, the more it intervenes. This leads you to sabotage opportunities right before they materialize. So your psyche shifts its strategy, now making you avoid trying altogether through fear and procrastination. Unfortunately, this also proves counterproductive as you start living a life far below your potential. You adapted your behavior to avoid the pain of facing your shadow rather than acting in the spirit of growth. The fear of failure did not match your conscious goal of success. When avoidance is the strategy, opportunity always gets sacrificed, and what you end up with is regret, resentment, and wasted potential. What all three of these examples tell us is that humans contain contradictions. Shadow work is often about achieving internal harmony, but parts of you will always resist integration. Yes, confronting your darkness is necessary, but it's uncomfortable and scary. Yes, self-awareness leads to freedom, but it means giving up comforting illusions. A therapist does not need to incentivize you to avoid physical danger because survival instinct handles that automatically. It is in your self-interest to stay alive. But how do you get yourself to care about psychological wholeness? How do you encourage yourself to face what you've spent a lifetime hiding? First, shadow work must be based around honest self-observation, not performance. If performance is the goal, then authenticity becomes impossible. So instead of trying to be perfectly good, you could simply notice when you're judging others harshly and ask what that reveals about you. This shifts the goal from appearing flawless to actually understanding yourself. Instead of suppressing anger, you could create space to feel it consciously without acting destructively. Fewer explosions, fewer passive-aggressive patterns, less buried resentment. This aligns the work with the actual goal, integration, not elimination. Instead of measuring progress by how little you feel negative emotions, measure by how aware you are of them. This ensures the work actually serves growth. Healthy psychological development does this naturally. You don't become whole by cutting out darkness. You become whole by bringing it into the light. Unfortunately, denial-based coping strategies are everywhere in modern life. Social media rewards projection of perfect lives. Corporate culture profits from workaholism that masks inner emptiness. Consumer culture sells temporary relief from the discomfort of unmet needs. This is not to say that all self-improvement is toxic, but the incentives are perverted. Anytime you have validation attached to denial, a great deal of energy and intelligence will be directed toward maintaining the facade. This is what we call a psychological complex. Look at all the patterns people repeat. Toxic relationships, self-sabotage, chronic anxiety, addictive behaviors, perpetual dissatisfaction. Each one of these has become its own self-sustaining cycle. The shadow profits off your ignorance. Repressed emotions profit off continued denial. Fear profits off avoided growth. Maybe it's time to focus less on appearing healed and focus more on the actual integration work that produces real change. Carl Jung famously said, "If you cannot understand why someone did something, look at the consequences and infer the motivation. If your life keeps producing the same painful outcomes, your shadow is showing you exactly what you refuse to see." One good way to dismantle a shadow pattern is to introduce conscious awareness to the emotions you've been avoiding. Awareness prevents problems from becoming endless wells of suffering to draw from. Without consciousness, the very defense mechanisms designed to protect you eventually mutate into prisons. Mechanisms that keep you trapped in repetitive cycles so they can keep operating. Perhaps you would be successful in breaking your patterns if you simply sat with the discomfort for a set period each day. This way, there wouldn't be enough unconscious space for the shadow to hide. Now, before this analysis makes you too cynical, I'd like to give you one example of shadow integration that actually worked. For decades, people tried to overcome negative traits through willpower and suppression alone. They believed if they just tried hard enough, the darkness would disappear. But it never worked. Symptoms returned, patterns repeated. Then depth psychology introduced a different approach. Face the shadow consciously. Instead of simply demanding people be better, therapists created a space for honest exploration. Feel the anger. Name the fear. Acknowledge the desire. No judgment, just awareness. Success rates improved dramatically. People reported feeling more authentic, less anxious, more in control. The approach flipped from, "I must eliminate this," to, "I can understand this." Another important thing to note is that good shadow work requires brutal honesty with yourself. You're best motivated when you stop performing for an imaginary audience. People tend to stay stuck when they don't have to face the truth of their patterns. Effective shadow work must also be ongoing. It's like peeling an onion. Each layer reveals another underneath. The psyche is infinitely complex. It's hard to know what will be the second and third order effects of facing one repressed emotion. Even the best therapeutic approaches eventually run into the limits of human willingness to change. That's where self-compassion comes in, the invisible force that allows shadow work to proceed without self-destruction. Good shadow integration is one where you can face your darkness without drowning in shame, where you feel curious rather than condemned, where you're connected to the understanding that everyone has a shadow. This is why effective therapists emphasize compassion constantly. If you have genuine self-compassion, integration becomes possible. When you don't have self-compassion, you end up in a situation where every discovered flaw feels like confirmation that you're fundamentally broken, and shadow work becomes just another form of self-attack. If you find yourself unable to accept your own complexity, what else is there to do except continue the exhausting performance? As Jung himself observed, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Then every person goes on pretending, projecting, and sabotaging themselves into oblivion.